The snow came early that year, and it came cruelly, as if winter itself had decided the village of Fenbridge did not deserve mercy. It was on such a night, with the wind cutting through the hedgerows like a blade honed on ice, that Eleanor Hartley found the boy. She had not meant to be out so late. She had gone to deliver a basket of linens to the rectory, a task her aunt had assigned her not out of kindness, but because no one else in the house wished to brave the cold, and Eleanor, being poor and useful and easily commanded, was never permitted to refuse. She was walking home along the crossroads, her shawl drawn tight, her breath rising in pale clouds, when she heard it, a small broken sound beneath the howl of the wind, not quite a cry, more like the ghost of one, as though the child making it had already begun to believe that crying would do no good. She found him curled against the stone wall by the old milestone, knees drawn to his chest, lips blue, his thin coat soaked through, and offering no warmth at all. He could not have been more than 6 years old. He looked at her with the flat, exhausted eyes of someone far older, someone who had already learned that strangers rarely stopped, and when she knelt before him and asked his name, he only shook his head, as though the question itself required more strength than he possessed. Eleanor did not hesitate. She would think, later, that this was the moment her whole life bent onto a new path. Not the grand ballroom scene she might have imagined for herself as a girl, not a chance meeting during a fashionable promenade, but this, a freezing child on a forgotten road, and a woman with almost nothing to give, giving it anyway. She stripped off her own shawl and wrapped it around him, gathered him into her arms though her arms shook with the effort, and began the long walk home, murmuring words of comfort into hair stiff with frost. She did not know as she walked that she was being watched. A man stood in the shadow of the old oak near the crossroads, still as the tree itself, his greatcoat dark enough to vanish into the night. He had been following the rumors of a lost child for 3 days, moving quietly through villages where such rumors tended to die quickly, smothered by indifference or fear. He had expected, if he found the boy at all, to find him already taken up by the parish, already logged into some overseer's ledger as an unclaimed burden to be shipped to the workhouse at Culford. He had not expected to see a slight, plainly dressed young woman stop in the middle of a freezing night, give away the only shawl she owned, and carry a stranger's child home as though he were her own. He watched until she disappeared past the bend in the road, toward a house whose windows glowed with a mean and grudging light. Then he exhaled, long and slow, the sound lost instantly to the wind, and he thought, with the particular weariness of a man who had spent months trusting almost no one so, "It begins with her." His name, though the village would not learn it for some time, was Adrian Ravensworth, 9th Duke of Alderbrook, and the boy shivering in Eleanor Hartley's arms was his nephew, the only living proof that his late brother Julian had married for love instead of duty, and the single, fragile obstacle standing between a great fortune and a cousin who wanted it very badly indeed. Eleanor did not know any of this. She knew only that the house she was walking toward would not welcome what she carried. Her aunt, Mrs. Prudence Colborne, met her at the door with a candle in one hand and disapproval already arranged upon her face, as though she had been rehearsing it the moment she heard footsteps on the path. "What," she said, "is that?" "A child, aunt. He was freezing on the road by the crossroads. I couldn't leave him. You could have summoned the parish beadle." "At this hour? In this weather?" "He would have died before anyone came." Eleanor's voice did not rise, though her heart was hammering. She had learned long ago that raising her voice in this house only invited longer punishment. "I will care for him tonight. Tomorrow I will inquire after his people." Mrs. Colborne's mouth thinned to a line. She was not in truth a cruel woman by her own estimation. She gave to the church. She was civil to the vicar's wife. She prided herself on respectability. But respectability, in her accounting, did not extend to strange orphan children tracked into her home, on a night when her daughter Cassandra was expecting a caller the very next morning. A caller of some consequence. A gentleman new to the district who had taken rooms at the Fenbridge Arms, and whose fortune, rumour already insisted, was considerable. "He will not be seen, Mrs." Colborne said at last. "Keep him in the scullery. I'll not have Cassandra's prospects ruined by gossip that this house takes in beggar children from the road." It was, Eleanor thought, as close to permission as she was likely to get. She murmured her thanks and carried the boy past her aunt, up through the cold passage to the small room behind the kitchen that had, over the years, become hers by default. Too plain, too draughty, too far from the family's better chambers to be considered anything but a servant's afterthought, though Eleanor was, by blood, the family's own niece. She built up the meagre fire herself, rubbed the boy's hands and feet until colour crept back into them, and fed him the last of the bread she had been saving for her own breakfast. Watching his eyes fill with something that broke her heart more than his tears would have, a wary, disbelieving gratitude, as though warmth and food together were more kindness than he had learned to expect from the world. "What is your name?" she asked again, gently, once the shivering had eased. He hesitated a long while before he answered, in a small voice roughened by cold and disuse. "Tam, Tam," she repeated, as though testing the shape of it. "Well, Tam, you are safe tonight. I promise you that much." She did not know, as she said it, how large a promise it would prove to be, nor that a man in a dark greatcoat was, at that very moment, standing outside the Fenbridge Arms, deciding that he would need a false name, a humble coat, and a great deal of patience if he meant to learn the truth of Eleanor Hartley's heart before he risked everything upon it. Eleanor Hartley was 23, an age at which her aunt frequently reminded her that most young women were already established, already married, already someone's responsibility, rather than a burden upon another's household. She had come to live with the Colbornes 8 years ago, after her father, a country curate of modest means and considerable warmth, had died of a fever that took half the parish with him. There had been no money, no property, nothing but Eleanor herself, and her aunt had taken her in with the particular generosity of someone who intends to be thanked for it forever after. In practice, this meant that Eleanor mended and fetched and sat up with Cassandra when Cassandra had the headache, and wrote the household's correspondence in her clear, careful hand, and was permitted to attend the assembly dances only when a chaperone was needed, and never, under any circumstance, considered a candidate for a partner herself. She had grown used to being spoken over, planned around, forgotten in doorways. She had grown used, too, to believing that this was simply what her life would be, useful, invisible, unclaimed, and she had built, in the quiet architecture of her own mind, a kind of private dignity that no one could see, and therefore no one could take from her. It was this dignity, more than any hope of reward, that had sent her out into the snow to save a stranger's child. By morning, the household had reorganized itself around the fiction that no such child existed. Cassandra, golden-haired and quick to laugh, breakfasted in high spirits, chattering about the gentleman expected to call. A Mr. Hale, newly arrived, said to be acting as land agent for some absent landowner. Modest in manner but, Cassandra had heard, not at all modest in his coach or his linen. "Mamma says he is exactly the sort of man one ought to encourage," Cassandra said, buttering her toast with the particular satisfaction of a young woman who had never once doubted she would be encouraged in return. "Eleanor, you will help me dress my hair before he comes, won't you? You always have such a clever hand for it." "Of course," Eleanor said, because she always said of course, and because it cost her nothing to be useful in this one small way, even as it cost her quietly something else entirely. She did not think of Mr. Hale again until he was standing in the Colbornes' drawing-room that afternoon. Hat in hand, and she was carrying in the tea tray because the housemaid had been sent to scrub the scullery floor, where a strange child's muddy boots had left their mark. He was not what she had expected from Cassandra's breathless description. He was tall, certainly, and there was something in the set of his shoulders that suggested a man unused to being told no, but his coat, though well cut, was plain dark wool without ornament, his cravat simply tied, his manner quiet rather than commanding. He might have been any respectable gentleman of modest, independent means. It was only his eyes that gave him away as something more, though Eleanor could not have said then what exactly they gave away, only that they were watchful in a way that unsettled her, as though he were cataloguing the room and everyone in it with a care that had nothing to do with idle curiosity. Those eyes found her the moment she entered, and something in them sharpened. "Miss Hartley, is it not?" he said, before Mrs. Colborne could even complete the introduction. "I understood there was a niece in the household. You understand a great deal for a stranger new to the district, sir," Eleanor said, and then flushed, because it had come out sharper than she intended, and her aunt's expression had already curdled with warning. But Mr. Hale only smiled, a small private smile, as though she had said something that pleased him rather than offended. "A land agent learns to ask questions, Miss Hartley. It is the whole of my usefulness." His gaze held hers a moment longer than was strictly proper. "I hope I have not given offence." "None at all," she said, setting down the tray with more care than it required, grateful for the excuse to look away from eyes that seemed, absurdly, to be reading something in her she had not chosen to reveal. He did not offend her again that afternoon, though he watched her more than he watched Cassandra, a fact that Cassandra herself did not notice, being far too occupied with her own performance of charm to observe where his attention actually settled. He asked, at one point, whether the household had heard talk of a lost child in the district, some tenant's boy gone missing, he believed, or an orphan turned out by ill fortune, and Eleanor felt her aunt's gaze land upon her like a physical weight, and felt her own face carefully arrange itself into blankness. "I have heard nothing of the sort, Mrs. Colborne said smoothly. "Fenbridge is a quiet parish, Mr. Hale. We do not often have strangers. And yet you have one now," he said, with a slight incline of his head toward Eleanor. And for one terrible moment she thought he meant Tam, that somehow he already knew, before she understood, from the faint warmth in his tone, that he had meant only himself. A graceful turn of phrase, nothing more. Still, she found, when he had gone, that her heart had not entirely settled, and she could not have said whether it was fear or something else entirely that kept it unsteady. Tam remained hidden in the scullery for 4 days, and in that time Eleanor came to know him the way one comes to know a wounded animal, slowly, through patience rather than questioning, earning trust in inches. He would not speak of his family beyond a single detail, offered on the second night as though it cost him something enormous to say it aloud, that his mother had called him her little lord, and had made him promise, before she died, never to remove the small locket that hung beneath his shirt, sewn now into the lining of his coat, where it could not easily be found or lost. Eleanor had seen the locket only once, when she changed his clothes to wash them. It was silver, tarnished, engraved with initials she did not recognize, a J entwined with an M, and she had thought little of it beyond a vague, sad wondering about the parents who had given it, and where they had gone, and why a child so young should be left to wander frozen roads alone. She did not know that the initials belonged to Julian Ravensworth and Mary Ashdown, a curate's daughter he had married in secret 4 years before his death, in defiance of a family that would never have permitted the match, nor that this small silver locket was, in the eyes of a great many powerful people, worth considerably more than the house she stood in. She did know that Mr. Hale called again on the 5th day, this time under the pretense of consulting her uncle's old maps of the parish boundaries, and that he found some reason to walk in the garden with her afterward, and that he asked, with careful casualness, whether she had ever heard the surname Ravensworth spoken in the district. "The Duke's family, do you mean?" Eleanor said, surprised. "Alderbrook Hall is not 5 miles from here, though I have never seen the Duke himself. He is said to keep to London mostly, or abroad. Why do you ask?" "Idle curiosity," Miss Hale said, and something in his voice made her glance at him sharply, because it was, she was almost certain, a lie, though a kind one, she thought. The sort of lie a private man tells to protect something that is not yet ready to be spoken of. She did not press him. She had her own secrets, after all, curled up warm and fed in the scullery behind her, and she understood, better than most, the particular loneliness of carrying something too large and too dangerous to share. It was Mr. Hale himself who discovered Tam 3 days later, and the manner of the discovery told Eleanor a great deal about the sort of man he truly was, even before she understood why it mattered so much. He had come to the house on some pretext of business with her uncle, who was, as usual, absent, a fact that seemed to trouble Mr. Hale not at all, since Eleanor had begun to suspect his true business was never truly with her uncle. She had been carrying a bowl of broth toward the scullery, moving quickly, hoping to avoid exactly the kind of encounter that now occurred. Mr. Hale, rounding the passage from the drawing-room at precisely the wrong moment, coming face to face with her outside the very door she had been instructed to keep shut against all visitors. For one long, frozen second, neither of them spoke. "Miss Hartley," he said at last, quietly, "I think you had better let me see him." She could have denied it. She could have claimed the broth was for herself, that the room held nothing but linens and boots, that he had misunderstood entirely, but something in his face stopped her. He was not looking at her with the avid, hungry curiosity of a man collecting gossip. He was looking at her the way one looks at a locked door one has been searching for a very long time, with something that might have been hope and might have been dread, and she found, against all sense, that she trusted the look more than she trusted her own instinct for caution. She opened the door. Tam sat upon the small cot in the corner, wrapped in a blanket too thin for the season, his dark eyes going instantly wary at the sight of a stranger. Mr. Hale went very still. Eleanor watched something move across his face. Recognition, she would have called it. Though the boy had certainly never met him before, or grief perhaps, sudden and sharply controlled, the way a man controls himself when he has trained for years not to weep in front of others. "What is his name, Mr.?" Hale asked, very low. "Tam, he would not give me more than that." "May I?" He gestured toward the cot, and at her nod, crossed the small room and knelt before the boy with a gentleness that surprised her. This quiet land agent with his watchful eyes, kneeling on a scullery floor as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Tam," he said. "That is a good name. Do you know, I once knew a man who called himself Tam, though his true name was rather longer and rather more trouble to say." Something in the boy's face eased, very slightly. "Was he your friend?" "My brother, Mr. Hale said, and his voice, for just a moment, was not entirely steady. Eleanor watched this exchange with a strange tightness rising in her chest, some instinct she could not name whispering that she was witnessing something far larger than a kind stranger's sympathy for a lost child. She did not yet understand what it meant. She understood only that when Mr. Hale rose at last and turned to her, his composure fully restored, something fundamental had shifted between them, a debt incurred, though she could not have said by whom to whom. "I must ask you something, Miss Hartley," he said quietly, "and I must ask you to trust that I have good reason for the asking, though I cannot yet explain it fully. Has the boy any mark upon him, a locket, a token, anything his mother might have left as proof of who he is?" Eleanor's breath caught. "How could you possibly know to ask that?" "Because I have been searching for this child for 3 months, Mr. Hale said, and I believe, Miss Hartley, that you may have just saved a great deal more than one small life." She did not understand what he meant. Not fully, not yet. But she understood enough to know that the quiet, watchful land agent standing in her scullery was not entirely what he claimed to be, and that whatever truth he was withholding, it had already begun to reshape the ground beneath her feet. He told her only a little that day, enough to secure her silence, not enough to satisfy her curiosity. The boy, he said, might be the heir to a fortune presently in dispute. There were those who would wish him ill if his existence became known before certain proofs could be properly established. He must beg her, with all the earnestness he possessed, to keep Tam hidden and safe a little longer, to tell no one, not even her aunt, more than she already had. He would return. He would explain everything, in time. He asked this of her not as a land agent might ask a favor of a stranger, but with an intensity that suggested the asking cost him something, that he was placing more trust in her than he had placed in anyone for a very long while. "Why me?" Eleanor asked, because it seemed, suddenly, the only question that mattered. "You do not know me, Mr. Hale. I am nothing, a poor relation, useful for fetching and mending. Why trust me with something so important?" He looked at her for a long moment, and there was something almost pained in his expression, as though her question had touched a wound she could not see. "Because 3 nights ago," he said quietly, "I watched a young woman give away her own shawl to a freezing child she had never met, on a road where no one would have blamed her for walking past. I have spent a good deal of my life among people who calculate every kindness for its return, Miss Hartley. I know the difference when I see it." He paused. "I would trust you with a great deal more than a secret, I think, if you would let me." Eleanor did not know what to say to that. She stood in the cold scullery with her hands twisted in her apron, feeling something unfamiliar and dangerous bloom in her chest. Not quite hope, because hope had never served her well, but something adjacent to it, something warmer and more frightening. "You had better go," she said at last, "before my aunt wonders what business a land agent has lingering so long over maps." He smiled, that same small, private smile, and bowed, and left her standing in the doorway with her heart beating far too quickly for a woman who told herself sternly all the way back to her narrow room that she was being a fool. The weeks that followed unfolded with a strange suspended quality, as though the ordinary rules of Eleanor's life had been quietly set aside. Mr. Hale called with increasing frequency, always with some pretext, maps, boundaries, a query about the parish register, and always found some means of speaking with Eleanor alone, however briefly, however carefully chaperoned by circumstance rather than intention. He brought small things for Tam, a warm coat that he claimed had belonged to a nephew who had outgrown it, a set of wooden soldiers whittled, he said, by his own hand on a long evening at the inn, though Eleanor privately suspected they had been purchased at considerable expense, and roughened afterward to disguise the fact. She began, despite every resolution to the contrary, to watch for him. She began to notice the particular quality of quiet that settled over her when he entered a room, not the anxious, effacing quiet she wore for her aunt, but something calmer, as though his presence asked nothing false of her. He listened when she spoke, which was itself so unfamiliar a sensation that she sometimes found herself talking longer than she intended. Startled into confidence by the simple fact of being heard. "You are wasted here," he told her once, as they walked the garden path under the pretense of discussing drainage for a field that did not in fact exist. "You know that, I think, even if you have trained yourself not to say it." "I am not wasted," Eleanor said, stung despite herself. "I am useful. There is a difference, Mr. Hale, between being wasted and being unwanted for the thing one wishes to be. And what is the thing you wish to be?" She had not expected the question, and found, to her own surprise, that she had an answer ready, one she had never spoken aloud to anyone. "I wish to matter to someone," she said quietly, not for what I can do for them, but simply for what I am. I have been useful my whole life, Mr. Hale. I have never once been chosen. Something moved across his face then, swift and unguarded, gone before she could name it. I think, he said, very low, that you underestimate how easily a person might choose you, Miss Hartley, if you would only permit yourself to be seen. She did not know how to answer that. She looked away toward the bare winter hedges and said nothing, and he did not press her further, though she felt his gaze upon her the whole walk back to the house, warm as a hand laid gently against her spine. It was Cassandra who first sensed that something had shifted, though she mistook entirely the shape of it. I begin to think Mr. Hale calls rather more often than a land agent's business strictly requires, she said one evening, brushing out her golden hair before the glass while Eleanor sat mending in the corner, as she always did, useful and unregarded. Mamma says he must certainly mean to make me an offer soon. He is not so very handsome, I suppose, but I am told his connections are excellent for a man in trade of that sort, and one cannot be too particular at 23, though of course that concerns you rather more than me, Eleanor. She laughed, not unkindly, merely thoughtlessly, the way she had always laughed at Eleanor's expense without ever quite noticing the wound it left. Eleanor said nothing, though her needle paused over the fabric, and something cold and unhappy settled in her stomach, not because she believed Cassandra's assessment correct, but because she could not, for the life of her, be entirely certain that it was wrong. What claim had she, after all, upon a gentleman's regard? She was poor, plain by her aunt's frequent estimation, entangled already in a secret that could ruin her should it come to light. She told herself, fiercely, that she wanted nothing from Mr. Hale beyond his continued discretion regarding Tam, and she told herself this so often, in the days that followed, that she very nearly believed it. The danger, when it came, arrived not from gossip, but from blood. A stranger came to the Fenbridge Arms in the second week of the new year, a gentleman of cold, elegant bearing, who gave his name as Mr. Reginald Ravensworth, and who let it be known with careful indifference that he was making inquiries on behalf of his family regarding a missing child said to have wandered into the district some weeks past. He was, Eleanor learned through the anxious half-whispered gossip of the village, cousin to the Duke of Alderbrook himself, and, more troublingly, presumptive heir to the dukedom should no closer claimant ever be found. She understood, with a lurch of cold dread, exactly what this meant. Mr. Hale came to her that same evening, his composure thinner than she had ever seen it, his eyes shadowed with something close to fear. "You must not let the boy be seen," he said without preamble the moment they were alone in the garden. "Reginald Ravensworth means to find him before I can secure the proof of his birth. And I promise you, Miss Hartley, if that man finds the boy first, no power on earth will keep Tam safe. He has motive enough to see the child vanish entirely, and he is not a man troubled over much by conscience." "Who are you?" Eleanor asked, low and urgent, because the question could no longer be postponed. "You speak of dukes and heirs as though you belong to that world yourself, Mr. Hale, and I begin to think you do. I have trusted you with a child's life. I think I have earned the truth." He was silent a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had changed, quieter, stripped of its careful land agent's ease. "You have earned it 100 times over," he said, "and I will give it to you, I swear it, the moment it is safe to do so. But I beg you, Eleanor, a little longer. A few more days. If I tell you now and you are questioned, your ignorance may be the only shield either of you has left." It was the first time he had used her Christian name. She felt it land somewhere beneath her ribs, warm and unsettling, even as fear for Tam crowded out every other feeling. A few days, she agreed, though something in her already suspected the cost of that waiting would prove higher than either of them intended. She was not wrong. Reginald Ravensworth called upon the Colborne household 2 days later, ostensibly to pay respects to a family of some local standing. In truth, Eleanor understood the moment he entered the drawing room, to study every face present for some flicker of guilty knowledge. He was handsome in a cold, symmetrical way, his manners faultless, his eyes assessing everything with the patient thoroughness of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted eventually, if not immediately. "I understand," he said, over tea, with an idle smoothness that fooled Mrs. Colborne entirely, and set every nerve in Eleanor's body ringing with alarm, "that there has been talk in the district of a lost child. A boy, unclaimed, wandering near the crossroads some weeks past. I wonder if any of you might have heard particulars." "We have heard nothing of the kind, Mrs. Colborne said, with perfect oblivious confidence. "Fenbridge is a quiet parish, sir, as I'm sure you'll find." "How curious," Reginald said, and his gaze, unhurried, moved across the room and settled, for one long, terrible moment, upon Eleanor. "You seem quite pale, Miss Hartley. I hope I have not distressed you with talk of lost children." "Not at all." Eleanor managed, grateful beyond words for the years of practiced composure her aunt's household had forced upon her. "It is only rather warm by the fire, sir." He did not believe her. She could see it in the faint, satisfied narrowing of his eyes, the way a man looks when a suspicion has just been confirmed rather than dispelled. He left soon after, all correct farewells and cold civility, and Eleanor stood at the window watching his carriage roll away down the lane, with her heart hammering so violently she thought the whole room must surely hear it. Mr. Hale came that night, after the household slept, tapping so softly upon the scullery window that Eleanor, keeping vigil beside Tam's cot as she had every night since Reginald's arrival, nearly missed it entirely. "He suspects," she whispered, the moment she had let him in, Tam sleeping fitfully behind her. "Reginald Ravensworth, he looked at me today as though he already knew everything." "Mr. Hale, I am frightened." "I know," he said, and there was something raw in his voice now, something that had shed the last of its careful disguise. "I am frightened too, Eleanor, more frightened than I have been in a very long while, and not only for the boy's sake." He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, too unsettled by fear to observe the proprieties that had governed every previous meeting between them. "I must tell you the truth now, whatever the cost of it. I owe you that much and more besides." "Then tell me," she said, and braced herself, though nothing could truly have prepared her for what came next. "My name," he said quietly, "is not Adrian Hale. It is Adrian Ravensworth. I am the Duke of Alderbrook, and the boy sleeping behind you is my brother Julian's son, the only living proof of a marriage my family has spent 4 years trying to erase, so that the title and every acre attached to it might pass instead to the very man who called upon you this afternoon." Eleanor stood very still. She heard the words, understood them individually, and yet could not, for several long seconds, assemble them into a meaning she was willing to accept. "You are the Duke," she repeated faintly, as though testing whether the words might rearrange themselves into something less impossible. "You have been the Duke this whole time. You let me believe, you let me think you were a land agent, a stranger of modest means, and all the while I did not know when I first came here whether I could trust anyone in this village," he said, urgent now, watching her face with something close to desperation. "I have spent months chasing rumors that led nowhere, meeting people who saw in Tam only a means to extort money from my family, or a burden to be handed off to the nearest workhouse for the fee it would spare them. I disguised myself because I needed to see people as they truly were, not as they performed for a duke. And then I saw you, Eleanor. I saw what you did on that road, with nothing to gain and everything to lose, and I could not make myself walk away and simply observe from a safe distance any longer. I meant to tell you sooner. I have wanted to tell you for weeks. I did not know how, without losing something I had come, very much against my own better judgment, to treasure. "You tested me," Eleanor said, and her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it shook with a feeling too large and too tangled to name cleanly, hurt and fear, and something like humiliation curling cold through her chest. All this time, every conversation, every kindness, I thought I was speaking with a man who saw me as I am. Instead, I was a specimen, Mr. Your Grace, a piece of evidence in whatever investigation you were conducting. "That is not true," he said, low and fierce. "It began that way. I will not lie to you. I came to watch, and I stayed to learn what sort of protector Tam might need. But it did not remain an investigation, Eleanor, not for weeks now. You must believe that." "Must I?" Her eyes stung, furious and humiliated in equal measure. "Forgive me if I find it difficult to trust the sincerity of a man who has spent our entire acquaintance lying to me about his own name." He opened his mouth to answer, but at that moment a sound came from outside, the soft, unmistakable creak of a footstep on frozen ground, where no footstep ought to be, and both of them went utterly still, every private grievance suddenly swallowed by a fear far more immediate. Adrian moved to the window and looked out into the dark, his jaw tight. "Someone was there," he said quietly. "I cannot be certain who. But Eleanor, we have very little time left to keep this secret at all." He was right, though neither of them yet knew how little time remained, nor how much would be lost before it could be regained. The morning brought catastrophe dressed in the ordinary clothes of a Tuesday. Mrs. Colborne discovered Tam herself, not through any confession of Eleanor's, but because Reginald Ravensworth, having indeed set a man to watch the house through the night, had called at first light with a magistrate's letter in hand, and an expression of righteous, triumphant concern, claiming he had reason to believe stolen property, a child no less, possibly kidnapped from a grieving family, was being concealed within her household. Mrs. Colborne's horror at the accusation was, Eleanor understood even through her own dread, entirely genuine. Whatever her faults, her aunt had never imagined herself harboring a criminal, and the shame of the insinuation struck her far harder than any tenderness for Eleanor's plight. "You have made me a party to deception in my own house, Mrs." Colborne said, white with fury, once Reginald had gone, satisfied, promising to return with proper authority within the day. "A stolen child, Eleanor. Do you understand what this means, what this will do to Cassandra's prospects, to this family's name, if it becomes known you have been harboring some vagrant's brat under my very roof, without my knowledge or consent?" "He is not stolen," Eleanor said, desperate, though she dared not yet say what he truly was. "Aunt, please, I beg you to trust me a little longer. There is more to this than you know, and if you would only, I have trusted you a great deal more than I ought. Taking in a penniless niece these 8 years and asking nothing in return but obedience and gratitude," her aunt said, and there was real hurt beneath the anger now, which somehow made it worse. "You will remove that child from this house today, Eleanor, or you will remove yourself along with him. I will not have my family ruined for the sake of your soft heart." It was Cassandra, unexpectedly, who found Eleanor weeping in the scullery an hour later, Tam pressed close against her side, both of them uncertain where in the world they might now go. Cassandra had heard everything. The household was too small for secrets of that size, and for once her pretty face held nothing of its usual thoughtless self-regard. "Is it true," Cassandra asked quietly, "that Mr. Hale, that he is truly a duke, and this child his nephew?" Eleanor, past the point of caring what confidences she kept, nodded. Cassandra was silent a long moment, something working behind her eyes that Eleanor had rarely seen there, genuine reflection, rather than performance. "I have been unkind to you," she said at last, low and unhappy. I never thought of it as unkindness, only as the way things were, you being poor and plain and useful, and me being, well, I begin to see it rather differently, watching you hold that child as though he were your own, with nothing to gain from it at all. She hesitated. I will not tell Mama it was I who helped you. But I will help you, Eleanor, if you will let me. There is a gate at the back of the garden Mama never thinks to watch. It was, Eleanor thought later, the first truly generous thing her cousin had ever offered her. And it came, cruelly, at the very moment everything else seemed to be collapsing. She fled with Tam through that gate within the hour, uncertain of her destination, guided only by the desperate hope that Adrian, she made herself think the name now, though it still felt strange and enormous in her mind, might yet find some way to make this right. She did not get far. Reginald Ravensworth's man found them on the lane before noon, and though he did not lay hands upon her, his presence alone was enough to freeze the blood in her veins, a silent, watchful escort that made flight impossible, and left her nothing to do but wait, trembling for whatever came next. What came next was Adrian himself, riding hard down the lane with a fury in his face that Eleanor had never seen there before. Not the careful, watchful Mr. Hale, but a man wearing his true rank at last, cold and absolute and entirely unwilling to be trifled with. "Stand away from her," he said to Reginald's man, in a voice that required no second command, and the man, recognizing authority when it finally showed itself plainly, stepped back at once. Reginald himself arrived moments later, and whatever composure he had maintained through weeks of careful maneuvering finally cracked at the sight of his cousin standing openly, unmistakably, in his true identity at last. "Adrian," he said, and something ugly moved beneath his cold civility. "So the game is finally over. I confess I wondered how long you meant to play at land agent while I did the honest work of actually searching for the boy." "The honest work," Adrian said, with contempt so quiet it was somehow worse than shouting, "of terrorizing a household and threatening a magistrate's letter against a woman who has done nothing but shelter a freezing child. I know precisely what you intended for Tam, Reginald, the moment you found him without witnesses present. Do not insult us both by pretending otherwise." "You cannot prove a single word of that," Reginald said, though something flickered behind his eyes that suggested the accusation had landed closer to truth than he wished known. "I do not need to prove intention," Adrian said. "I need only produce proof of birth, and I believe, cousin, that proof has been within my reach for some weeks now, thanks to a woman with rather more integrity than either of us deserves." He turned to Eleanor, and his voice gentled, though his eyes remained hard as flint. "Eleanor, the locket. May I see it?" She had it in her pocket, sewn hastily into a fold of cloth that morning in her flight. She had not been able to leave it behind, some instinct insisting it mattered more than she yet understood. She drew it out with trembling fingers and placed it in his palm. Adrian opened the small clasp, something Eleanor had never thought to attempt, and within, folded so small it had escaped every previous inspection, lay a scrap of paper, yellowed and creased. Bearing a parish register's careful hand, the record of a marriage between Julian Ravensworth and Mary Ashdown, witnessed and dated 4 years before Julian's death. Reginald went very still. "My brother was thorough," Adrian said quietly, even in his secrecy. "He knew, I think, that a day might come when this proof would matter more than his own comfort. He gave it to Mary to keep safe, and Mary, dying, gave it to her son in the only form small enough for a child to carry unnoticed. This is Thomas Ravensworth, Reginald, the rightful and undisputed heir to Alderbrook, proven beyond any further argument you might wish to raise. I would advise you to make your peace with that now, quietly, rather than force a public reckoning that will not favor you." For a long moment, No one moved. Then Reginald, his face gone the colour of old ash, turned without another word and walked back toward his waiting carriage, defeat settling over him like a coat too heavy to wear with any grace. It was not, Eleanor understood, an ending exactly. Men like Reginald rarely surrendered so easily in truth. But it was, for now, a retreat, and after the terror of the morning, even a temporary peace felt like an enormous mercy. Adrian turned to her at last, the locket still held carefully in his palm, and something in his expression had gentled entirely. All the cold authority of moments before dissolved into something far more uncertain. "You saved him," he said quietly. "Twice over now, once on a frozen road, and once by carrying proof you did not even know you carried, through danger you should never have had to face alone. I did not do it for reward," Eleanor said, still shaking. Tam pressed close against her side. "I did it because he was a child, freezing, and I could not walk past." "I know," Adrian said. "That is precisely why it matters so much." But knowing his gratitude, Eleanor found, did little to soothe the wound of his deception, and in the days that followed, as word of the Duke of Alderbrook's true identity spread through Fenbridge like fire through dry grass, she discovered that being publicly vindicated was not at all the same as being privately healed. The village, predictably, transformed its opinion of her overnight. Where once she had been the poor, overlooked niece, mended dresses and all, she was now spoken of in hushed, avid tones as the young woman who had sheltered a duke's heir, who had walked beside his grace himself in disguise for weeks, without ever suspecting. A romance, the gossips decided almost instantly, ready-made for their delight. Mrs. Colborne, scenting advantage where days before she had scented ruin, began speaking of Eleanor with a warmth so sudden and so transparently self-interested that it turned Eleanor's stomach more than her aunt's earlier coldness ever had. "You will forgive me, I hope, for my harsh words," Mrs. Colborne said, all smiles now. "When you understand I acted only from concern for the family's reputation. I am sure His Grace will see that I meant nothing but good sense by it." "I understand entirely, Aunt," Eleanor said, with a quiet, careful courtesy that concealed exactly how little she believed the apology sincere. It was Cassandra's gossip that wounded most, though it came, ironically, from a place of pride rather than malice. Cassandra, delighted by her own small role in Eleanor's rescue, could not resist confiding the whole dramatic tale to her particular friends, and the story, passing from mouth to mouth as such stories do, acquired embellishments Eleanor had never intended, and could not now retract. By the time it reached its fullest, most colourful form, the village had convinced itself that Eleanor had known Adrian's identity from the very first evening, that she had deliberately positioned herself to catch a duke's eye through calculated displays of virtue, that her famous kindness on the frozen road had been, in truth, a performance staged the moment she glimpsed a fine gentleman's carriage passing through the district. The unfairness of it struck Eleanor like a physical blow. She had given away her only shawl to a freezing child, with no audience at all, no thought of reward, and now that same act was being reinterpreted, twisted, made small and calculating by people who had never once troubled themselves to know her true character. She began, in the days that followed, to withdraw from the village, from the Colborne household's newly warm attentions, and, most painfully of all, from Adrian himself, whose visits she now received with a careful wounded distance that he could not seem to breach, however he tried. "You believe I orchestrated this," she said to him once, when he called and found her cool and correct, and entirely unwilling to be drawn into easy conversation. "The gossip believes it, and I begin to wonder whether even you, in some private corner of your mind, wonder whether I knew more than I confessed, whether some part of my kindness was calculation rather than truth." "I have never once doubted you," Adrian said, low and urgent, Eleanor, I know precisely what you did and why, because I watched every moment of it with my own eyes, disguised though I was. I know your kindness was real before you had the smallest notion who I was. Then why, she said, and her voice broke slightly, betraying the depth of hurt beneath her careful composure. Does it still feel as though I am being punished for it? I am spoken of now as a schemer, your grace, when 3 weeks ago I was spoken of as nothing at all, and somehow, absurdly, I find I preferred being nothing. At least then the unkindness aimed at me was honest. Adrian was silent a long moment, watching her with an expression she could not fully read. Grief, perhaps, or guilt, or something more complicated still. I did this to you, he said finally. Not the gossips, not your cousin's careless tongue. I did this, by concealing my identity as long as I did, by letting our acquaintance grow under false pretenses until the truth, when it finally broke everything around it as well. I told myself I was protecting Tam. I told myself I needed to see people plainly before I revealed myself to them. But I think, if I am honest, I also simply did not wish the disguise to end, because I feared, I still fear, that once you knew what I truly was, I would lose whatever regard you had begun to hold for the man you believed to be plain Mr. Hale. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, something in his admission loosening, very slightly, the tight knot of hurt in her chest. And has that fear proven true? She asked quietly. I do not know, he said, with an honesty that cost him something visible. I only know that I would rather risk losing you as a duke than keep you as a lie. It was, Eleanor thought later, the nearest thing to a confession he had yet made, and yet it was not enough. Not while the village still whispered its unkind version of her story, not while her own heart remained too bruised to trust easily what it most wanted to believe. The final trial came, as such trials so often do in a small community, at a public gathering, the Fenbridge Assembly, held that year in the modest hall behind the church, its usual quiet gaiety transformed entirely by the knowledge that the Duke of Alderbrook himself, along with his newly acknowledged nephew, would be in attendance. Eleanor had not wished to go. It was Adrian who had asked her, quietly the day before, not as a summons but as a request she was free to refuse, and something in the humility of the asking had persuaded her, against her own better judgment, to attend after all. The hall was full of eyes the moment she entered, and she felt every one of them, felt the particular weight of being watched, not with the old indifference, but with a new, avid speculation that was in its way, its own kind of cruelty. Cassandra, to her credit, stayed close at Eleanor's side throughout the evening, offering what protection her presence could provide. A small penance, perhaps, for the gossip her earlier pride had set loose. It was Reginald Ravensworth's final gambit that forced the reckoning Eleanor had not known she still needed. He arrived uninvited, his composure fully restored, and made his way through the assembly with the particular smoothness of a man determined to salvage something from certain defeat. He found Eleanor near the refreshment table and addressed her, loudly enough that half the hall might hear, with a courtesy so exaggerated it could only be intended as insult. Miss Hartley, how very fortunate you have proven yourself, securing not only a duke's gratitude but, I understand, his particular attentions besides. One wonders how deliberately such fortune was pursued. The hall went quiet around them, the way a room does when it senses a spectacle unfolding. Eleanor felt her face heat, felt the old familiar urge to shrink, to apologize, to make herself smaller so as not to invite further attack. And then, quite suddenly, she felt something else instead. A hot, clean anger that steadied rather than shook her. I found a freezing child on a dark road. Mr. Ravensworth, she said clearly, her voice carrying further than she had intended, though she found she did not wish to call it back. I gave him my own shawl because I had nothing finer to give, and I carried him home not knowing whether I could even feed him through the week, let alone whether he might one day prove to be a duke's heir. I did not calculate an advantage. I did not perform a virtue for an audience. I acted as any person of conscience would act, and if my conscience has since been rewarded by circumstances beyond my design, I will not apologize for it. Nor will I permit you, of all men, to call it scheming, when your own interest in that child was never once about his welfare. A murmur moved through the hall, and Eleanor, her heart pounding, did not look away from Reginald's furious, reddening face. It was Adrian who moved first, crossing the room to stand beside her with a deliberateness that left no doubt whatsoever as to where his loyalty lay. "My cousin," he said, addressing the room at large in a voice that carried the easy, absolute authority of a man who had spent his whole life being obeyed, has spent 3 months attempting to locate my nephew, for purposes I will not trouble this company by detailing plainly, though I think most of you can guess their character well enough. Miss Hartley found that child on a night when the temperature fell low enough to kill a grown man, let alone a boy of 6, and she sheltered him at considerable risk to her own reputation and comfort, asking nothing in return. I watched her do it. I watched her care for him for weeks afterward, never once suspecting what he might be worth to anyone, and I can tell this assembly, with absolute certainty, that there is no finer character in this county than the one currently being slandered by a man whose only true grievance is that his scheme has failed. The silence that followed was profound. Then, from somewhere near the back of the hall, someone began, hesitantly, to applaud, and the sound spread, gathering warmth as it went, until the room that had gathered to whisper about Eleanor's supposed calculation instead rang with something closer to admiration. Reginald, finding no ground left to stand upon, made his excuses and departed, and did not, Eleanor would later learn, ever trouble the district again. Adrian turned to her once the room's attention had, mercifully, begun to disperse into ordinary conversation once more. "I should have said that weeks ago," he said quietly. "I should have defended you the moment the gossip began, instead of letting you carry the weight of it alone, while I worried over disguises and proofs and family politics. I am sorry, Eleanor, truly." "You have said it now," Eleanor said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that the word settled something in her that had been unsettled for days. Perhaps that is what matters most. Not that a wound is prevented, but that someone is willing to stand in the open and answer for it afterward. "I would stand there every day of my life if you would let me," Adrian said. Low and unsteady in a way she had never heard from him before, this careful, watchful man laying down, at last, every remaining piece of his composure. "I did not disguise myself to test you, not truly. I disguised myself because I did not trust the world to show me anything real. And then you showed me something entirely real, without even trying, and I have not been able to stop thinking of it since. I love you, Eleanor. Not the version of you gossip has invented. Not a duchess-shaped notion of what might suit a title. You, exactly as you are, plain shawl and mended dress, and a heart too large for the small life this village has tried to force upon it. I do not ask you to forgive the deception easily, or all at once. I ask only that you let me spend whatever time it takes proving the rest of it was never a lie." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, this man who had watched her from the shadows of a frozen road and never once looked away since, and felt the last of her careful protective distance finally give way. "I think," she said softly, "I forgave you rather sooner than I let myself admit, Your Grace. I was only afraid to say so, in case it turned out after all to be another kind of foolishness." "It is not foolishness," Adrian said, "to trust a man who has already shown you, in every way he knows how, exactly who he means to be." He took her hand then, there in the thinning crowd of the assembly hall, with a gentleness that asked rather than claimed, and Eleanor, feeling the whole weight of 8 quiet, overlooked years lift slowly from her shoulders, did not pull away. The spring that followed brought changes to Fenbridge that the village would speak of for years afterward, though never again, Eleanor noticed with some private satisfaction, in the sly, speculative tones they had once reserved for her. Tam Thomas Ravensworth, as he was now formally known, heir presumptive to Alderbrook, grew steadily stronger and steadier of spirit under the combined care of an uncle who had waited a lifetime to properly love someone, and a woman who had never once needed a title to teach her how. He called Eleanor by a name of his own devising, halfway between gratitude and family, that made her laugh and weep in equal measure the first time she heard it. Adrian did not propose with any grand performance, though Eleanor privately suspected he had considered several before discarding them all as somehow untrue to the quiet, careful nature of what had actually grown between them. He asked her instead in the scullery of the Colborne house, of all places, on the very spot where he had first knelt before a frightened orphan, and let his own careful disguise crack for the first time. "I have loved you in 2 names now," he said, "Mr. Hale and Adrian both, and I find I love you exactly the same beneath either one. Will you let me love you under a 3rd, as my wife, and as Alderbrook's Duchess? Though I promise you the title will never matter to me half so much as the woman who wears it." Eleanor, who had once believed herself destined to be useful and unclaimed for the whole of her life, found she had no hesitation left in her at all. "Yes," she said, "though I think you should know, Your Grace, that I intend to go on mending my own gowns, regardless of what any duchess is meant to do instead." "I would expect nothing less," Adrian said, laughing, a full, unguarded sound she had come to treasure above almost every other, and kissed her there in the scullery's plain, honest light. With none of the careful watchfulness that had first brought him to Fenbridge, only the whole unhidden truth of a man who had finally, fully, been seen and chosen in return. They were married in early summer, at the small Fenbridge church rather than the grander chapel at Alderbrook, because Eleanor had asked for it quietly, and Adrian had granted it without a moment's hesitation, understanding, better than most men of his rank ever learned to, that some things mattered more for their simplicity than their splendor. Cassandra stood among the witnesses with genuine tears in her eyes, her earlier thoughtlessness long since mended into something like true friendship. Mrs. Colborne wept as well, though whether from sentiment or from satisfaction at her family's elevated connections, Eleanor chose, with a generosity she had learned rather than inherited, not to examine too closely. Tam walked beside them down the church path afterward, one small hand in Eleanor's, the other in Adrian's, no longer shivering, no longer alone on a frozen road with no one in the world to notice him, and Eleanor, looking down at the boy whose cold, frightened face had first led her, unknowing, into the whole of her new life, thought that some kindnesses, however small they seem in the moment of their giving, have a way of returning to warm the very heart that offered them, 100-fold, for as long as that heart continues to beat. She had asked for nothing on that dark, freezing night, but the chance to save one small life. She had been given, in the end, a family entirely her own, and a love that had watched her, quietly, patiently, from the shadows, until it finally trusted itself to step into the light.